Okay, good morning and welcome everyone. I'm Zanae Dames, the Marketing and Events Manager at Digital, and I'm pleased to welcome you back to our webinar series for this month's topic, Strategies for AI Governance, Staying Ahead in an Evolving Landscape. As myself and much of the Digital team are based in Vancouver, British Columbia, we respectfully acknowledge that we work, learn, and live on the traditional ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared with our audiences in the coming week. If at any point during the session you have a question, please type it into the chat and we'll address them at the end during the Q&A portion. That's it from me, and I'll be handing it over to Jane, our Director of Intellectual Property and Partnerships, to get this webinar started. Thanks, Jane.
Thanks so much, Zanae. And bonjour, everyone, and welcome. It's wonderful having attendees from across the country for this month's Thought Leadership Power Hour. Whether you're new or returning as one of our over 1,000 participants who joined us last year, we're thrilled that you're here with us today. Next slide, please. With an increasingly rapid adoption of AI across businesses and sectors, having strong governance frameworks is paramount to avoid operational risks, legal repercussions, and the potential for damaging public trust. And as AI evolves, so too do the frameworks surrounding this technology. An effective AI governance framework helps organizations align AI initiatives with core values and mitigate the risks of bias, errors, and other unintended consequences. As AI continues to disrupt industries, transforming everything from product development to customer experiences, ensuring that these technologies are ethical, transparent, and accountable is not just a regulatory requirement, it's a competitive advantage. Over these next 60 minutes, we'll explore current regulatory frameworks, essential components of responsible AI governance, actionable insights in implementing effective AI governance, and building responsible, fair, and compliant AI systems, whilst also looking at fostering that culture of responsible AI within your organization, and a Q&A portion to close us out. Next slide, please. Fundamental to the global innovation clusters is collaborative innovation, which is setting the framework for projects and initiatives that address cross-industry challenges whilst creating technology products and services that can scale across industries and ultimately across the world. Digital's IP strategy supports the development, ownership, and retention of Canadian IP through numerous vehicles, and informational sessions with thought leaders like we've today are one example of that. Next slide, please. I have the pleasure of introducing today's panel, thought leaders with AI governance as part of their DNA. Please join me in welcoming Justine Gauthier and Ashley Cassovan. Justine is General Counsel and Head of AI Governance at Mila, one of Canada's 3 AI research institutes, nationally and globally prominent at the intersection of academia, government, and industry. She's responsible for Mila's IP strategy for providing counsel on the legal, regulatory, and ethical implications of developing cutting-edge machine learning technologies and shaping Mila's internal governance of AI. She oversees a team with engagement across a variety of public and private sector organizations, from Fortune 500s to startups and SMEs in fields such as biotech, software, healthcare, finance, retail, and energy. And prior to joining Mila, practiced law at a top Canadian firm. Ashley is Managing Director of the AI Governance Center at the IAPP and a recognized technology policy expert who has dedicated her career to ensuring data and technology are used in a positive way, which promotes innovation while protecting the public. A member of the OECD's network of experts, co-chair of the Standard Council of Canada's AI and Data Standards Collaborative, and on the board of CIMEA. Prior to joining IAPP, she was Executive Director of the Responsible AI Institute, and during her time working with the Government of Canada, led the development of the world's first AI policy and first set of rules for how the public service uses AI in a responsible manner, which remains a gold standard for AI policy globally. It's a privilege to be in this virtual room with you both today, conduits between industry, policy leaders, and international organizations. And so with that, Justine, I'll pass it first to you to frame some of what we're going to dive into in our discussion.
Great. Yes. Hi, everyone. So we're going to start by an introduction of AI governance strategies, and then we'll kind of move on to more of a discussion fireside chat format. So I will be sharing my screen here. Let me just... All right, here we are. Okay, so I want to start by kind of acknowledging where we are right now. We're almost at the second half of 2025 in a couple months. And as everybody knows, I think it's not a secret. We're really right now, especially in the past couple of years, in pivotal years for AI and pivotal years for AI governance. So a bit of a recap of what we saw as trends in 2024. We really saw AI safety take center stage. There were multiple kind of international events around the AI safety theme and responsible AI theme as well. We also saw the EU AI Act as the flagship regulation and really being positioned as what would become the global gold standard, similarly to what we saw with GDPR. Many countries had draft regulation in the works, including Canada with Bill C-27, which we're going to briefly talk about. And in 2024 and even the first half of 2025, we also saw so many, voluntary codes, guidelines, frameworks being published, as well as standards. A lot around generative AI, kind of in response to the 2022, 2023 ChatGPT boom, but also on other topics in the AI sector as well. And we started to see the professionalization of AI governance, namely through efforts of organizations like the IAPP, which I'm sure Ashley will be able to talk about, and really getting people trained and getting people working on AI governance really as a profession. In 2025, so for the first few months, what we're seeing and what we're predicting, we all saw earlier this year at the AI Action Summit in Paris, the interventions of the U.S. government, the new administration. The U.S. government is really pulling back on AI safety, AI regulation. They're really, really going all in on AI development and kind of this race to artificial general intelligence. And we're seeing other countries somewhat following suit. In Canada specifically, mainly unrelated to the US context, but more related to our own political context in Canada over the past year. Canada's Bill C-27, which included a new law that was going to govern artificial intelligence in the private sector in Canada, is dead in the water. It did not, with everything that went on with our parliament over the past few months, this bill kind of died. Now, of course, especially this morning, waking up with the results of our election and seeing that the Liberal government will remain in power for a next term. That's why I added this morning my little question mark. Will Bill C-27 be resurrected? Are we going to see the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act take form or not? Are we going to see another type of AI regulation take form in Canada? It's very obviously unclear and early at this stage. The EU AI Act remains the key piece of regulation. It's the most comprehensive one that we have. But what I talked about that we kind of predicted in 2024, that it was going to become the global gold standard, and that similarly to the GDPR, people were going to use the EU AI Act even outside of Europe, for example, in the United States. That is becoming increasingly unlikely that will happen. And the result of that is that we really have an increasingly fragmented AI governance ecosystem, because there are some pieces of regulation. There's really not as much as we had initially thought. However, there are so many, as I said, frameworks, guidelines, kind of voluntary commitments. So it's really hard for organizations to kind of know where to position themselves, because it's not as easy as saying, well, I have this law and then I just, get my compliance or legal team on it and I can comply and I'm good. There's a bit of confusion in the ecosystem as to what are the best frameworks to rely on, what are the guidelines that we should follow. And of course, pace, and we're likely to see the rise of agentic AI in 2025, 2026 further challenge AI governance frameworks. So this is where kind of we are, given all of that. We're in a global context full of tension. So generative AI is really everywhere and growing. There's a global race to AGI. It's really become increasingly a geopolitical and even national security issue. And when we say that generative AI is everywhere and growing, that includes obviously organizations. AI is really starting to permeate through organizations, intentionally or not, right? Sometimes I'll speak to some organizations that are not in the technology sector, and that will tell me things like, well, we're not done our digital transformation yet. This AI thing is really scary. We don't know where to begin. So, we're not going to do AI for like a couple of years. We're going to get through our digital transformation, and we'll put that kind of in the on the schedule a bit later. The reality is that AI is already very, very likely within your organization, whether that be because some employees are using tools like ChatGPT, or whether that be because, in the Microsoft or Google suites that we use, these tools are kind of being embedded now in a lot of things that organizations rely on. So the result is that a lot of organizations kind of feel overwhelmed and don't know where to start. Again, speaking to all of the different frameworks and guidelines and standards out there, and without kind of a key piece of regulation to rely on, it's hard to know where to begin. And there's a bit of a dichotomy because in some organizations, and I'll look a bit more to the US, I did say we're in a global race to AGI. There's this movement that we saw in other technological advancements before of move fast and break things. We're just going to go on development and not really think about the risks, think about regulation. And then on the other hand, on the other extreme, and what we sometimes see a bit more, namely in the Canadian context, is, as I say, this kind of feeling of organizations feeling paralyzed. So it's not move at all because we don't know what to do, we don't know where to begin, and obviously that also comes at a cost of falling behind. So I really think that AI governance and what we're going to talk about today is kind of the way to be in a bit more of a middle ground between these two extremes, right? Not move fast and break everything, but also not be completely paralyzed and move very, very slowly because we don't really know how to adopt AI. We don't really know how to adopt it in a responsible way and in a way that we can manage our risks. So what is AI governance? If you ask this question to different people in the ecosystem, they might have different answers. The way I like to look at it is through three different layers. So in AI governance, there's what we call the environment layer. So that is looking at what is the context that I evolve in. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, but basically regulation that applies to me, ethics, standards, things like that. And then we go to the organization layer, and that's where a lot of my work happens. So for organizations, what are the frameworks, the internal policies, the processes that I'll put in place to ensure that we're using or developing or both AI in a responsible way? And then the third layer is really the system. So the actual AI systems and AI models that we're developing or using, things like model evaluations and audits, things like that. So on the environment framework, obviously this is in constant evolution, and there are many different types of categories in that section. So we did talk about laws and regulations. I'd maybe like Ashley to tell us a little bit about what's happening in industry standards and norms, because there's a lot happening in that space. And obviously there's also ethical societal principles. And then the last two are a bit more organization driven, but you're also adopting and using AI, obviously in the context of your broader organizational mission, of your values, and also of your stakeholder expectations, depending on the type of organization that you are in. But Ashley, would you like to say a few words about what's happening in the standards world these days in AI?
Yeah, thanks, Justine. I think it's really important, based on what you've shared, that we are not seeing necessarily a one-size-fits-all legislation that's then really implementable through all the various different contexts of AI. And I think that, even as you mentioned, I really appreciated that even if organizations think that they're not using AI, they probably are, because it's being so increasingly embedded into a lot of existing technical software that you might already be using. And so things like this are important to keep in mind when you're then thinking about your governance initiatives more broadly, and really trying to understand how is AI governance different, or what is it that we need to do to augment our existing technical governance efforts to embed some of these structures, processes, etc. that Justine's speaking about. And so because of the fractured nature of all of the different laws and regulatory landscape that she's already spoken about, industry standards and norms become incredibly important and increasingly important for, I would say, the two pieces of why I just provided that context is that, one, AI systems are not one size fits all. They're also not entering into your environment in a one consistent manner. And so as a result, understanding even just responsibilities between the platform provider or the technology provider of the system, and then you as most likely the deployer, and sometimes there's third parties or many third parties involved in that situation. There's different industry standards that are evolving to buy those different or contextual uses of AI systems. And so we're starting to see even pre-existing standards for things like software as medical devices are looking to be augmented or updated to adhere to some of the challenges that are coming from AI systems in the healthcare space. But we're also starting to see where there's net new standards that are being developed, sometimes off of the back of existing types of standards that go through a similar type of process, or is ISO 42001, which is one of those frameworks, again, along the lines of what Justine's already shared, that is really allowing organizations to think through what are the different types of processes that I need to put in place, the rules that I need to put in place, the different committees or governance that I'm sure we'll get into in a moment. And so all of those, by allowing those to develop in the form of norms, organizations don't, and standards that are then adopted, organizations don't need to guess what it is that they then need to follow. We get many questions all the time. Should I follow the NIST AIRMF, which by the way, is not a standard, or should I follow ISO 42001? And the answer is often you're going to need to take a piece of a lot of those different things, but it really depends on your context. And so by having a better understanding or more domain-specific standards, which is how this is evolving, it's going to be a lot easier for organizations, just to go back to the healthcare example, that are going to say, okay, here's the common way in which I am using AI now that other organizations are also using. We work as, or this is our role within that environment, and so therefore here are the 5 standards that I need to be aware of and follow. And so that type of maturity from a governance perspective is, I think, where we're starting to see some evolution right now.
Yeah, thank you so much for those comments, Ashley. And again, seeing what we're seeing in the regulatory space with the US kind of pulling back on regulation and other jurisdictions kind of following suit in that matter, I think standards are already, but are going to continue to really be a key piece of AI governance, at least for the coming years.
Maybe one quick thing I should mention is that even though I think, again, probably out of the scope of this conversation, but I find it really interesting, your take on the Brussels effect, because I think there's a lot of nuance in there. And I think when people created, or when the notion was created for GDPR, it was a lot easier to have a plug and play in all those different circumstances. And so I think the bar that was set for if there's going to be a Brussels effect, that it's going to be implemented, is really, it was interesting on its own. Anyway, not to get too much into that.
Yes.
Clearly you can see that I'm interested in that. But I think why I mentioned that is because already within the EU AI Act, there was a dependency on that piece of legislation to have more standards and more guidance and guidelines come out. And so I think it's important that to note that, because I think even though the EU AI Act itself in its 500 pages might not be copy and pasted in the same way, or the same rules might not be applied, I do think it's going to be very influential in terms of the standards and norms that come out of that as a result of organizations that are going to be implementing the AI Act.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and maybe more of an indirect Brussels effect than a direct one. Absolutely. I'm gonna keep going here on the different layers. So now, in terms of the organizational layer of AI governance, I'm not going to go through all of these 10 pillars, and we're going to talk about some of them, I think, in the fireside chat portion. But this is just to show that obviously AI governance for organizations is not just putting, a policy in place for the use of generative AI tools by your employees, right? That's a really great place to start. And often that's like a low-hanging fruit that's kind of easy to address. But obviously there's so much more to AI governance than, internal policies and processes. I think, talking about AI governance board and oversight. So what are the roles of the different stakeholders within the organization in terms of AI governance? What goes up to the board level, executive level, and other teams? And of course, and I think we're going to talk about that. And actually, maybe you want to also jump in here. Education, training, and awareness, obviously being a huge part, a really, really key pillar of AI governance for organizations.
Yeah, I think that education, training, and awareness is really important as we just talked about these norms and standards and laws are still evolving, that it's really dependent on then the people, those professionals that you talked about earlier, to be the ones to navigate, translate all the rest of those pillars or items that you're seeing on this map here. And so from that perspective, really understanding the, or having that competency and knowledge, and even Article 4 within the AI Act, I like that your distinction between direct and indirect influences states that those who are overseeing or managing AI systems do need to have a certain degree of competency and knowledge for the oversight. So that's why and we'll speak to it more later, but we're really focused at IPP from building professionals is focusing on that training and education.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to move on to the system layer, and rather than kind of go into a technical, which I'm not either a technical expert, so I would rather let other people do that, but rather than go into a technical jargon about kind of model evaluation and audits, I want to talk about, and Ashley, you kind of touched on that on an earlier comment, at the system level, the first question obviously to ask yourself is, which system are you talking about? And that may seem kind of obvious, but I liked actually your comment about thinking of how different AI systems are entering through your organization. And I think for a lot of people, AI is seen as this one thing. And again, going back to some conversations that I've had with people in organizations, it's like, AI is this thing and we're either going to do it or we're not going to do it. And if you ask people about, how their organization views AI, they are likely to maybe think of only one of the three categories I have here on the slide, or maybe two. And I think it's really important when you're thinking of your AI adoption strategy and your AI governance framework to think about those things. So we like to think, or I like to think of AI systems from an organizational point of view. There's kind of like three entryways or three types, right? So personal productivity, that's kind of the easiest one. That's your employees using tools like ChatGPT or Gemini to increase their personal productivity at work. So that is one. The second one is what we call embedding AI in internal operation processes optimization. Examples would be your legal team using AI to analyze and negotiate contracts, or your finance team using AI to optimize workflows. It could also be things like insurance companies using AI to help in analyzing claims, things like that. And then the third one is actually integrating AI in your products and services that you're providing to either your customers, your clientele. And there can be many examples. There's an example there. One that a lot of organizations start with is providing your customers with an AI-powered chatbot that can help them navigate either your products or services. So again, your AI governance framework, while on the kind of overarching themes and values and principles, these should apply whether it's one of these three types of AI systems. But in terms of the nitty gritty and how you're actually going to put that in place, that will probably vary, obviously, and the approach will vary between those different types of AI systems. So we're going to talk about that, I think, Ashley and I also in the discussion phase, but given all of this, kind of where do you start? How do you define your AI adoption and AI governance strategy? So I've put a few questions here to kind of get people started, and we can share this material if people are interested. I think Something else that I've seen, especially, for example, at the board level, executive level, depending on the type of industry, but especially in kind of non-technology sector organizations, is treating AI, because we hear so much about the risks and the potential fallout, treating it as kind of a purely risk-based topic. For example, similarly to the way that boards and executive teams deal with cybersecurity, it's a risk that needs to be mitigated. And I think obviously that would be a mistake, because in the case of AI, yes, there are risks, but there are so many opportunities to be leveraged for organizations. So I think that goes to my point here about really embedding it in your strategic planning, not only because there's opportunities, but because AI is already, but I think even more in the next months and years, it is going to have a profound effect on virtually all industries. So really kind of important to bake all of these reflections in your strategic planning. And then the second one I want to touch on is really anchoring AI governance in your organizational structure. And what I mean by that is, who are the people in my organization that I'm going to have working on this? Who am I going to have contribute to this? And I think we can talk about that a little later. It can really depend on the context of the organization, right? But there's many different ways of going about it. I think a couple key pieces, again, like training and education for people in your organizations that have other expertise that need to contribute to AI governance efforts within the organization. Obviously, these people need to be trained and upskilled in that topic. And in some organizations, you might actually need to really bring in an expert or a team of experts to work on this topic. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. And I see that, Ashley, you maybe had something to add here.
I just wanted to say, I think that just to reiterate, a lot of the conversation that I'm hearing right now is just even knowing what AI you're using. And so just to kind of add a sub bullet to, is there a clear vision? I think that understanding, and you got into it really with the context, but just even some of these big questions is, am I using AI? How am I using it? And then, like you were mentioning, the team that's surrounding it is who needs to be involved before you're even getting into establishing that clear vision and everything else. So I just, we're seeing this a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the last thing I'll touch on before we move on to more of the discussion is, I think an added challenge to AI governance for organizations is that, given the context, how things are moving, both on kind of the policy standards, regulation side, and the pace at which things are moving on the technology side, it's something that can't really be done in a fully linear fashion, meaning you're going to have a list of, okay, in Q1, we're going to do our inventory, and then, we're going to put a team together, and then we're going to do some training programs. After that, we're going to, look at what's going on and think about how we can integrate AI into our organization. I think all these things kind of need to happen at the same time, or a lot of them. And Ashley, maybe you would have interesting thoughts on that. But I think this approach really needs to be agile and iterative. And this goes back to the point of, I think for a lot of organizations that had a digital transformation kind of more linear plan, this is challenging that, because they'll say, well, we're not done our digital transformation. Even some, large organizations, we're still using paper for some stuff. How can we be doing all these things and talking about AI and, but it's no longer a linear thing. Like, it is kind of happening, and all those things need to be kind of thought together at once, which adds complexity. Again, this is why people from different teams in an organization need to be involved in some of these different sections or these different steps. But I think this is really a key message. If you kind of go about it in a very linear way and say, okay, we're going to do a training program, we're going to draft our AI adoption strategy. I reviewed one a couple of weeks ago, an AI governance framework, and in the document, it literally said, this is kind of a trivial example, but this document will be reviewed every 3 years. And it's like, No, like that's not like it's very unlikely that you will be able to use your same AI governance framework and same AI adoption strategy in even, 6 months, let alone 3 years. So again, this is just going further to that message of um, things need to be really agile and iterative, and the monitoring of what's going on the technology side, in your market, in your industry, and also the regulatory developments that may be affecting the way that you adopt AI. Really important to make sure that you have someone or that people have the resources that they need to keep abreast of all these changes. It's really a challenge right now because there's so much happening, but it is possible to stay abreast. And there's some really great, obviously, resources, again, namely from the IAPP, that kind of allow you to keep updated with everything that's going on and make sure that you're trickling that into what you're putting together in your organization. So I think with that, I will stop, share my screen, and really curious to hear Ashley's thoughts maybe on that last section, and move on into a discussion with Jen.
Yeah, I would love to just add that I think all of this, if you're new to the realm of AI governance and we say things like, we need to do this every 6 months, which I completely agree with, it sounds scary or daunting because a lot of organizations that I've done work with are like, well, we only meet twice a year, or we only have enough time and space for meetings, these governance boards once a quarter. So I think part of the challenge with moving from a linear to more of a cyclical process around this is part of the process change that you need to have, but it's not meant to be daunting. It's just the reality of the nature of AI systems are a socio-technology that has implications. So that means that it could have, or I say that to mean that it could have different harms and risks of other types of more static systems that you have. But also, it's also intended to mean that because they change, and the nature of the systems is that they're changing so often and regularly, that it's a bit like, I hadn't been used this analogy before, so bear with me for a second, but like when you haven't seen a friend in a really long time and you don't have that much to say to them, but you see a friend regularly and you have lots and lots to talk about because you're getting into some of those details. They know what's happening. And I think you sort of need to treat your governance less like the friend that you see on a quarterly basis, and you do this kind of like more normal checkups of like the big milestones or big risks or things that are happening. You really want to get into some of those details of like, why was this changing? What kind of implications did that have? Do we have consent for the data that we're using for this system because we're using it from a different context? And so I think that these are all things that, especially as organizations are learning how to embed these systems into their environment, you just need those catch-ups more frequently. So it's not meant to be really scary and, oh, now we need to have like massive governance meetings with all of these people all of the time. It's just those more frequent, but maybe less significant check-ins, or have a tool that helps you to monitor that in a better way.
Wonderful. Thank you both. Maybe we can dive in. Thank you for sharing kind of, sort of the primer around this and the level set with everyone. And we can get into maybe also the unpacking of the practical, a little more into the practical side for those that are joining us today and kind of, sort of wondering, at which junction, they're kind of stepping into this. So maybe we can look a little bit more around, from both of your seats. What does an effective, responsible AI governance framework look like in practice from the different lenses that you see?
I'm happy to start. I think that there's maybe just because of the time that we have, not to get too much into it, given that Justine kind of went through a lot of those foundational pieces already. I would like to just say that there's a lot of resources that are available that you have access to that help you to figure out how to set up or establish a governance program. I do think following something like the NIST AI RMF or the ISO 42001 framework is a really helpful way to almost use it as a checkbox exercise. Do I have a governance committee? Do I have policies and processes in place? Do I have an inventory of different types of AI systems? And a lot of these, and again, there's resources available, cross-reference with the requirements that are in the AI Act. I do think that that's a good starting point. And then the other thing that I would say is we've been thinking a lot, and I can put a link into the chat, on thinking about what does an AI governance professional look like. And I think why that matters in this context is because, again, a lot of the work in absence of these rules is going to be on the people that are navigating that. But what it also hints at is we've done a survey and it talks about the organizational structure. So where are these teams within the organization themselves? And so I think that's a resource that it can also help you if you're going through it to think about, okay, are we just augmenting our existing AI governance, and whether that, again, be your governance committee itself or the policies that governance committee would be subject to. These are things that I think those types of resources will help you think through that.
Yeah, I completely agree on all these points, and especially on the point around following some frameworks that are out there. There's a lot of really great resources, and I think obviously, if you ask me, I would wish that we would have a bit more regulation in place, but there is an upside to having these different frameworks and not having just this one kind of static and rigid piece of regulation that you need to abide to. You have all these different frameworks, guides. In Canada, there's also the voluntary code on the development and deployment of generative AI. They recently published a guide, especially for organizations that are deploying, so versus the development, but really, and that's a lot of organizations in Canada, right, that are not necessarily developing these generative AI models, but that are using it and deploying it. There are really a lot of great resources. So I think the strength there is that you can, depending on your context, look at which one will be the most useful for you, and you can also use discernment and saying, in some of these larger frameworks, what's the most relevant for me? What do I really need to prioritize versus other things that may not, apply as much. The other thing that I do want to say about effective AI governance frameworks is really getting the accountability structure right, for a couple reasons. So we talk a lot about, you need to put a committee in place on AI and AI governance. You want to have discussions on this topic at the board level. The executives are obviously going to talk about it too. Depending on your organization, obviously your technical teams, and if you do have development happening, there is a lot of different places where a lot of these discussions will be having place, which is great. But what we do see is, because of the multidisciplinary nature of this topic, and because you need people from all these different teams, in certain organizations, they're really great at putting these working groups and committees and all of that together. But when it comes down to actually having to make a decision, like, are we going to deploy this use of AI in this context on this data? Things can get a little tricky. The accountability structure is a bit off. People don't really know who's the true owner of those decisions. There's also really interesting questions there as to, should it be the teams, for example, like a CTO? Should it be, or should it be someone else that maybe is a bit more on the compliance or legal side? And again, I think that goes back to the whole idea of professionalization of AI governance, and having people in the room, if that is relevant to your context, that is really their job to think about these things. So I think the accountability structure really, really important. And then I also think, in terms of an effective, responsible AI strategy, the best way that I've seen in organizations approaching it, in terms of kind of the timing in which they do it, is to develop it alongside your AI adoption strategy. And kind of doing that relatively at the same time. And it doesn't mean that you need to, have your whole AI adoption plan for the next 5 years and do all of your comprehensive AI governance framework. You can start literally with one thing. For example, if you use the Google Suite, or we're gonna deploy Gemini for all of our employees. we're going to give access to them and they're going to be able to use it. Start with this project and say, okay, we're going to look at it from the business point of view, the technology point of view, and at the same time, we're going to work on, the governance aspects of that. Should we put together a policy? Should we? And I think the answer should be yes. Should we do a training session with our employees that not only talks about don't put personal data into it and it's dangerous. Yes, say those things, but also say, oh, and by the way, here's all the ways that you can use this thing to really help you and doing your job and leveraging those tools. So I think thinking of these things together and not as one and then the other is really, I found that to be really effective.
Awesome. Yeah. And I think you've kind of covered a couple of pieces here in terms of one, looking at, how are you a lot around the organizational sort of buy-in, right? And kind of that approaching it responsibly within the org. So, are there, as we kind of flesh out this a little bit, you've given us quite a few sort of takeaways here, when we're thinking about also that non-technical leadership, right? And sort of to your point, who's involved at what state, that can be, sort of difficult at times too, if they're not so comfortable. And then do you kind of let the technical sort of, speak more and they kind of become more intimidated around that? So if there's any sort of last nuggets there. And also I think too, and this is sort of Ashley and you, Justine, from the Mila lens of how are you looking at it from that employee across the business unit? So, are there also some strategies that you've seen working, in some of your examples? I mean, without maybe naming organizations if you can't, but some good practices that we can share to kind of follow on what you both have shared right now.
Yeah, I think there's a lot there. So maybe just starting with how are organizations thinking about structuring this, and just to go back to highlighting what some of Justine just said, is that this is going to look different in each organization. And so really understanding, like I said, with the cycle slide, is how are you and your organization using it? What is the domain that you work in? What are the pieces of legislation that are already applicable to you in your context? And that could be because of your domain, that could be because of your region, it could be because of who your customers are, because it's important to keep in mind that with legislation like GDPR or the AI Act, it's transnational in nature. And so you really, even as a Canadian company that might be providing services to EU customers, you are then subject to these pieces of legislation as well. And so really understanding in a digital world where you are providing services, not just in a physical space or a physical bricks and mortar store, what those implications are. And then I think that following, or really then, as you were mentioning, Jen, thinking about those various different rules that you need to adhere to those rules. And I'm hesitating to say comply, because it's not always just about compliance. It's not about checking a box and saying, okay, yeah, we've done this. It's really so that you can safeguard your organization, you can maximize the use of AI, like Justine's getting to, is whether that's comes through the format of training, or if it's just how you're positioning your strategy. It's not, there's a big difference in terms of how you can write your policies to put yourself in a position of, okay, well, AI is happening to us, and so here's all of the rules that we're going to put in place and all of the things that you can't do, versus recognizing what it could mean for you and your company, and making sure that that's built, that vision is built through your enabling policies, your training of how you're getting people comfortable and understanding how to use these various different systems, identifying and communicating effectively what your change management is going to be within your organization because of the implications. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. There's lightning and a lot of thunder. But there's it's really, really important to think through that. And again, you can't know that until you can't deal with any of those concepts in in a real and meaningful way in the abstract, or it's not going to be beneficial. And so I've given a lot of kind of 101 presentations to organizations, but every single time, not until we kind of get into the question and answer period where you're really understanding what their use is or what their issues are, can you give real and meaningful feedback and advice. And then I guess just to get to the last part is that, again, the resources that I was talking about earlier, and some I understand will be shared after with everyone, the AI governance report that we've put together is really around what does the profession mean? How is that being built? What do org charts look like? And there's 7 use cases in there that then walk through some of the different implications of these companies and or implementing AI governance in their organizations at a really high level. I think some of the key takeaways that I found really interesting is 30% of organizations have decided that they're going to adopt an AI governance program before they adopt an AI or they implement AI into their organization. So they're taking a proactive approach, which I find super, super interesting. We also saw that on average, companies imagine their AI governance teams to be about 9.8 people. And so it's not small. And I know 9.8 is very specific, but and that's because of there's obvious differences between a small and a large company. And then, like I was saying before, if the company is a developer or deployer of those systems. But there are only 2% of companies in our entire survey that said that they weren't going to do AI governance. So it's a thing. It's happening. I think that to the extent, and just to go back to the beginning of what I said, if you treat it like a checkbox activity, then you can say, yeah, we've got it and we've done these things, and maybe you'll satisfy your compliance efforts. But if you really do use AI governance as an enabling function for understanding how you're going to and what the opportunities for innovation within your company are and how governance can enable that by having all these different teams and skills that Justine's talking about work better and more effectively together, and then you have those policy pieces for people to more easily follow. I think, Jen, your comment about, oh, well, it's going to fall more on the technical team, and sorry, I'm paraphrasing, but I think that's one of the big concerns I saw when we were in the Government of Canada working on rolling out the Directive on Automated Decision-Making Systems, was that a lot of decisions were being deferred to technical people because it's like, oh, it's AI, but really it needs to be a combination of the product owner and the executive, like, what is it that you want to get out of this? And then finally, make sure that those engineers or other technical roles are at the table so that it's possible to implement it. And so anyway, a very long answer to say there's lots of resources because this is complex. It's not one size fits all. And it can be an enabling function, not something that's just done at the end, which goes back to, I think, Justine's point around think about it as a cycle, not as a linear process.
Wonderful. And I think, something you both have touched upon, it's a cycle. And I think almost as much, it's a mindset. It's really kind of what permeates kind of throughout your organization. And as I hear you both sort of, sharing these insights, that it really sort of isn't and mustn't sort of be a trade-off between sort of that innovation, speed, and governance controls without stalling progress. Like there's room and a necessity sort of for both, as you say, Justine, you're kind of speaking to, doing things in parallel, or even at the start of an ASHA, as you're talking about, even this most recent survey where that's already so top of mind, even before anything sort of happens. So to your point that it doesn't have to be a either or, like it really has to kind of dovetail where it exists and what you're seeing, I think, playing out in practice, in industry and academia and government and all the different uses that is happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, on the notion of kind of that we hear a lot about, like innovation versus, governance, and innovation versus regulation. I think, especially in Canada, like it's a bit of a false dichotomy. And actually, not to repeat what was previously said and what I kind of touch upon on the slides, but I've actually found that in Canada, because by nature, maybe we tend to be a little more risk averse. I found that a lot of Canadian organizations are actually slowing down or, paralyzing their AI adoption effort because they feel like that they haven't gotten the governance and risk management down, because, as I said earlier, they're kind of overwhelmed, and their board are very, very concerned about all the risks. And I think, addressing the AI governance piece is not, as Ashley said, just kind of a check in the box or a thing that you do after. For a lot of organizations, they need to feel like people in their organizations have that down, and they're handling that, and they're working on that together in order to be able to adopt AI. So I actually really don't see it as a trade-off. I actually see it as an enabler. And that when we're talking about big tech companies in the US, like building these large language models and this global race to AGI, my comments may be a little different, but I think, again, in the Canadian context where we have organizations, private and public sector, that are wanting to just adopt this technology, deploy it, really kind of add it to their offering, increase the productivity of their employees. I think it's really much more of an enabler than that trade-off that we tend to think about.
No, thank you for that context there. We talked a little bit, and I think you've touched upon it, with sort of the word, we hear this a lot, right? Kind of with risks and, to that part that a lot of folks hear in organizations. Is there something, that sort of hasn't come through that you both have talked around, sort of, is there something that's maybe an overlooked or maybe sort of more of a blind spot that you've seen in some adoption strategies, that may be something sort of food for fodder for organizations to think about, depending, again, what their context is?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult to answer the question because it's maybe Justine has a really great thought on it. But I think, again, context really, really matters. And so there's sure common risks or harms that are attributed to different types of AI systems. But again, it really depends on how they're being deployed, where they're being deployed, to who. That will make such a difference in terms of how you then approach those risks, mitigate them, and put appropriate governance around them. I think that one of the links that I shared to share with the audience after is, as Justine was mentioning, a lot of the work that's been done in some of the framework space as of late has been specifically focused on generative AI. And so another context, I've been talking about context in terms of how it's being deployed, who it's being deployed, where, as in like what domain, but the type of technology, AI is also not one type of technology. And so that also matters. And so that's why we're seeing a lot of the frameworks be specific for generative AI systems. And so the work that NIST has done to create a generative AI profile identifies harms that are specific to generative AI systems. And so I actually think that really, really amazing research has been done, starting from early linear regression models and their use on the different types of harms and risks. And so I actually don't think that that's been overlooked. I think the challenge is that these frameworks are generic and they're not getting into the detail even that we see within the NIST profile. And then you could provide a critique that the NIST profile is not getting into appropriate context or appropriate detail or nuance because of the context in which then you're operating in. And so I think that's why, back to my comments earlier on standards, not until we start to see a common taxonomy of uses of AI, or we kind of start to see some of these uses evolve, that there's a common suite of standards around, will we be able to answer your question around, are there things that are missing from those frameworks?
Okay.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, especially on the risks, related to AI systems themselves. There are risks, or what I would call maybe more like topics, that I do see sometimes being overlooked at the organizational level. A couple we've already touched on. So not having a clear picture of what AI systems are already in your organization, and the way that AI is already present, and the way that you're already using it. Another one is that I already kind of touched upon, especially in organizations that are a bit more concerned and risk averse, is the risk of doing nothing. That is a risk too. We can talk about all the risks of AI. And doing nothing can mean two things. It can be doing nothing about your AI governance, but it can also doing nothing in terms of doing nothing about adopting AI. And again, just having that kind of like wait and see approach and being slower. So obviously there are risks to that. And another one that I do see sometimes being overlooked, that's a bit of a different topic, is impact on the workforce. We talked about, the importance of training and education, and this goes back, I think, Jen, to one of your earlier comments as well, right? Like this all ties into change management and deploying that into especially like bigger organizations, large teams that are working in a lot of different ways, impact on those people. So it's not just about giving them, a training on, hey, here's how you're going to use, ChatGPT, and you're not going to use it. Here's, the opportunities. It's also meeting people, to be honest, like at some of their fears around what impact this is going to have on their future in terms of their job, of their career. And that obviously can be a personal question. There's also a big society question around that. But for organizations, more concretely, it can mean thinking about, already starting to think about, okay, well, certain roles in our organization are obviously going to change. What do we, how do we address that around workforce management? How do we get some of our talent to maybe upskill and train and be able to do their job differently, do something different? Not to open up, because I know we're almost done, so not to open a whole kind of can of worms around that topic, but that is happening. Like these systems are really getting increasingly effective, and the trend will just keep going in that matter. And I do see sometimes that even at the board level, this is something that your HR and governance committee should be looking at. And again, this all ties back to, this is all part of the broader picture of your organization, strategic planning. But I think impact on workforce and on employees is really something to keep in mind. And then you'll find, if you do address that, you'll find also where maybe you have some blockers. Why are people not using it as much? Why are people reticent or have reservations about all this AI kind of being deployed in the organization? So I do see that as a topic that's sometimes not as addressed because we're busy thinking about the really like system level risks, which we do need to do, but there's more human risks related.
Well, I think you've nailed it a bit as well in terms of, as you both were kind of speaking to, I know, Justine, you kind of started a little bit earlier, with this evolving sort of landscape from that sort of, there's that compliance and regulatory piece. I mean, there's this shift a little bit away from around what this safety, this focus around sort of safety. There's a public safety, a system safety, but also kind of this thinking when you talk about a risk of like impact on privacy, from, to your point, there's a whole other layer to this too, right? Around consent, around data collection, around transparency. So it's just as much external what a system is doing or collecting, but to your point, these fears that are coming, not even maybe from this, my AI is going to take my job, but what is being sort of monitored or compliance and the context around. So kind of curious your lens from both of you on, are you seeing sort of an emerging trend from this sort of governance adoption thinking sort of side of things where that may also start to play in a different way?
For sure. I think that the perspective is ultimately going to have to shift in terms of how we are viewing our digital products writ large. A lot of what we're seeing in our research is that because we started as a privacy and our roots remain as a privacy professional association, I lead our AI governance efforts, but there was a desire for that to even be part of IAPP because so many privacy professionals were being asked AI governance questions, or that was being added to their plate. And so that was why earlier I mentioned this interactivity between different legislation that could mean from different domains. It could also, like if you look at the EU AI Act, it's based on product safety legislation, and we haven't even gotten into what that means for product safety owners. I know we're at time, but I think this intersectionality is really important, and it really requires at least leadership from an AI governance perspective to have knowledge, the ability to translate and discuss with various different teams that they might not have before. I think that we've seen siloed governance for technology in the past. I know that's been my experience. And so the ability to not only think in that cyclical nature like we've been talking about, but also to think about it in terms of it being that team sport and where and when do you use various different skills and players on your team is really, really important to understand as you're building out this AI governance process. We're seeing people from cybersecurity, from data governance, from data management. That is not the same thing as privacy. Really be part of these governance teams, not to mention that whole engineering and product teams. Last week at our privacy summit, we just had a choreographer that was talking about her work in robotics and AI and robotics. And so I think that even as we were saying before, as this technology evolves, so too will the different perspectives and the different types of people that you need to be part of that team. Part of another link I'll share is last year we built out a digital governance report and talked about what those teams look like. And so it'll be a complement to the other professional reports. So I'll link that in as well.
Wonderful. And as we, kind of get to sort of time, just wondering from both of your sort of perspectives, what's sort of that key takeaway that you'd like to sort of leave those in the audience with today?
Yeah, I can go. I think on my end, key takeaway would be, again, not feeling it's normal to feel a bit overwhelmed where there's so many resources, even the ones that we're going to send you, and they're all great, but there's so many things that you could be reading and relying on. You can start small. And again, like going back to what Ashley was just talking about, there are existing frameworks, policies in your organization that can be built upon. That can be a great place to start. So for example, like your privacy impact assessments. Okay, how can we make perhaps to those or augment those to take into consideration AI risks? There's building blocks that are probably already existing in your organization that you can start on. And then the second one is, again, as I mentioned earlier, you can start small. Like start with one project of AI adoption in your organization and test out the compliance and governance and ethics side of it, and just kind of treat it as a pilot project. Learn, and then you can apply what you've learned to the phase where you're gonna be building out your broader framework. So you can, and I think you should, start small, and that'll help people not feel so intimidated that this is a huge mountain and it's so complex and there's all these things to think about and we need to bring in everybody. You can start like step by step, again keeping in mind that the steps should kind of be circular and not linear.
Yeah, and I think just adding to Justine's point is that even though the space is, and I feel it every single day, and I've complained to Justine about this, it's overwhelming. There's so much going on. You constantly feel like you're missing out on something. And I do not mean this in like a FOMO way. I mean it in like, am I supposed to also know this now? And am I also supposed to talk to these people? Like it just can be a lot. And so I think that I would be remiss if I didn't say that education and training are very, very important foundational pieces of knowledge to have in order to just orient yourself and understand what is important, what is foundational. And so even to a point that we were talking about earlier with the 6 months and the updating of policies, the one thing that I did want to add when we were talking about that is that even though I think it's important to go back and look at it every 6 months at a minimum, it doesn't mean that you're changing everything whole scale every 6 months. And so even it just speaks to that iterative, agile nature. And that's, I guess, why I was thinking about that analogy of Friends is like, you don't need to like do the backstory and catch everybody up on all of the things. You're sort of just adding or augmenting, making sure that it's still going according to plan. And that I think is really key. And that's why getting a foundational knowledge of the training of what's what organizations do you go to for information, what people do you follow on LinkedIn, whatever your source is of this, and then scope it in a way that makes sense for you. If you if you're not using generative AI, which could be very likely within your organization, don't dig into all of those details yet. But if you are using it, and all of a sudden, I think that we've mentioned this, like Gemini or ChatGPT shows up on your allowed tools, start getting into what those implications are for you and your organization. If you're general counsel, make sure that you have the right, we haven't talked about contracts, make sure the right contracts and languages are in place. And so I think that just as a starting point, try not to feel overwhelmed by everything. There's organizations like ours that are trying to interpret and distill that, but being knowledgeable on your own and getting training, whether it's our AIGP program or something else that suits your needs, I think is a really effective way to start, so that you, just can orient yourself within this complexity.
No, thank you both. As we conclude today, I think, the sort of the takeaways is just start, start somewhere to both of your points. And I think what you both have kind of really sort of talked through, and I, thank you enough from on behalf of Digital and those in the room with us today, is that you're not alone. It's constantly evolving, and it can be hyper complex and super iterative, but you're also in it. We're in it together, as organizations, as employees, as nations, as part of this broader ecosystem. We're trying to figure it all out kind of together. And so you don't have to have we don't, and we won't in many ways. And so thank you so much for sort of bringing that down to these distillable sort of, pieces that folks can kind of take away with, and whatever that means in their organization, big or small, and start. So on behalf of everyone, thank you both so much. We look forward to bringing you back again, later in the series, and sharing these different resources, and continuing this. So Zane, I'll pass it on to you, but thank you so much for carving out time.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you all once again for joining the webinar today, hosted by Digital and our wonderful Director of IP, Jen. All those attending today will receive a follow-up email in the next couple of days with any resources discussed throughout this session and the webinar recording. And that's it from us at Digital. We'll see you at our next webinar session. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.